Hi Angels. This is Shadows and Sparks by the Angel Demon on AO3. Summary. In Shadows and Sparks, Hitoshi Shinsou and Izuku Midoriya form an unlikely bond that grows from friendship into something deeper as they train together at UA High. Through shared challenges and unspoken understanding, they find strength, trust, and a sense of belonging that transforms them both. With Aizawa watching over them, Hitoshi learns to let down his guard, embracing a connection that helps him see his own worth, while Midoriya gains a steadfast partner by his side. Chapter 1, New Beginnings, Old Bonds. Aizawa Shoyuta settled into his chair at the back of Class 1 as homeroom, seemingly engrossed in paperwork. From behind his stack of files, he observed the quiet scene of his students, discussing upcoming training exercises. It was a typical afternoon, filled with the low buzz of students winding down from the morning's intense lessons, their laughter and chatter filling the room. He found his eyes lingering on Hitoshi, as he often did, though he'd never admit it to anyone but himself. The years he'd spent training Hitoshi privately had nurtured an unspoken bond between them. Aizawa had always been one to show his concern through actions rather than words, and he knew Hitoshi respected that. Watching Hitoshi enter UA High School as a member of Class 1A had filled him with pride and, if he was honest, a bit of concern. Hitoshi had fought hard to be here, but Aizawa wondered if he'd be able to let his guard down enough to fit in with his classmates. That was a tall order for anyone, let alone a student who had faced more judgment than friendship in his life. As his gaze drifted over the classroom, he noticed the shift before he could place it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone unfamiliar with Hitoshi's expressions. But to Aizawa, the faint smile tugging at the corner of Hitoshi's mouth was unmistakable. The smirk held a shade of warmth and something else, a softening that Aizawa had rarely seen. It was the look of someone who felt comfortable, safe even. Aizawa's curiosity sharpened as he followed Hitoshi's gaze. Standing before him, gesturing wildly in mid-discussion, was Midoriya Izuku. Hitoshi seemed genuinely captivated by whatever Midoriya was rambling about, nodding every now and then, his usual detached posture softened into something more open, more engaged. Midoriya's animated expression was matched by his enthusiastic gestures as he explained some hero theory, his voice rising and falling with the passion that had always defined him. Hitoshi, for his part, responded with his trademark cool demeanor, arms crossed but clearly invested. Aizawa tilted his head, a thoughtful frown barely perceptible on his face. Over the years, he'd seen many people attempt to break through Hitoshi's walls, and he knew just how guarded his son was with people he didn't trust. Trust was something Hitoshi granted sparingly. But here, with Midoriya, something was different. There was a spark of recognition, an understanding between them that went beyond casual camaraderie. Aizawa hadn't expected Hitoshi to form connections so quickly, but perhaps he had underestimated both his son and Midoriya. It was no secret that Midoriya had an impact on those around him. His resilience, his kindness, his unwavering drive to help, these qualities seemed to draw others in, even those who were initially reluctant. Aizawa knew this firsthand, having seen Midoriya's influence on classmates who had been wary of his unrelenting optimism. Maybe Hitoshi, too, had found something in Midoriya that resonated with him. As the bell rang for lunch, students began filing out, their chatter filling the hallway with laughter and plans for the break. Aizawa, still pretending to be occupied with his paperwork, noticed that Hitoshi and Midoriya were lingering in the room, standing by the doorway and seemingly oblivious to the bustling crowd around them. "Are you joining us for lunch?" Midoriya's voice, always a little too loud in his excitement, reached Aizawa's ears. He tried to hide his amusement, sensing Hitoshi's slight discomfort. Hitoshi shrugged, his usual nonchalance firmly in place, though there was a hint of warmth in his voice that Aizawa noticed. "Guess I could. Better than eating alone." Midoriya beamed, and Aizawa could tell that his enthusiasm was infectious. "Great. We usually sit outside when it's nice like this. I think you'll like it." The two walked out together, their conversation fading into the corridor as they joined the flow of students headed toward the cafeteria. Alone in the room, Aizawa allowed himself a small, approving nod. This was good for Hitoshi, he could see that clearly. While he had taught his son to defend himself, to be strong in the face of adversity, there were limits to what Aizawa alone could offer him. Friendship, companionship, these were things Hitoshi would need to find on his own. And perhaps, if Midoriya was part of that journey, then Hitoshi would discover a side of himself he hadn't dared to explore. Leaning back in his chair, Aizawa allowed his thoughts to wander further. It had been a risk, taking Hitoshi under his wing and bringing him into UA. Not because he doubted Hitoshi's abilities, but because he knew how harsh the world could be to those with misunderstood quirks. But Aizawa had seen the potential in Hitoshi, recognized the fire that drove him to prove the world wrong, to carve out a place where he belonged. In Midoriya, perhaps Hitoshi had found someone who understood what it was like to fight for acceptance. They were both, in their own ways, outsiders trying to fit into a world that often seemed too quick to judge. If Midoriya could help Hitoshi open up, to feel like he was part of something, then Aizawa would do whatever he could to support that friendship. A soft sigh escaped him, and he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Aizawa knew he couldn't shield Hitoshi from everything, nor would he want to. Part of being a parent, he had learned, was giving his child the space to find his own path, even if it meant making mistakes along the way. But even so, he would watch. He would be there in the background, just in case. After all, it wasn't every day that Aizawa Shoyuda let down his guard, but for Hitoshi, he'd learned to make an exception. With one final glance at the empty classroom, Aizawa gathered his things, a subtle smile tugging at his lips. This year would indeed be interesting. And maybe, just maybe, it would lead to a future he hadn't anticipated, for all of them. Lunch hour was usually a time of reprieve for Aizawa, an opportunity to catch a breath, maybe even indulge in a few minutes of silence before the afternoon training sessions. But today, as he sat in the staff lounge, nursing a cup of steaming black coffee, he couldn't shake the image of Hitoshi and Midoriya together. His thoughts drifted back to the classroom, to the subtle but unmistakable changes he'd seen in Hitoshi's demeanor. As he sipped his coffee, Present Mike, Yamada Hisashi, slid into the seat beside him with his usual flair, a wide grin stretching across his face. "Sho, you look deep in thought," Hisashi said, nudging him lightly. "Something up with the kiddos?" Aizawa glanced at him, arching an eyebrow. Hisashi always knew how to pick up on his moods. Even if Aizawa hadn't spoken a word, his friend seemed to instinctively know when something was occupying his mind. After a pause, he spoke. "Hitoshi," he said simply, his voice carrying that familiar gruffness, though softened by the underlying care he didn't often show. "Oh?" Hisashi's face lit up with curiosity. "How's our boy doing in Class 1A? I bet he's fitting right in." His voice held a note of optimism, and Aizawa couldn't help but feel a pang of gratitude. Hisashi had supported his decision to adopt Hitoshi from the start, and over the years, he'd become more than just a friend, he was family. "He's doing well," Aizawa admitted, keeping his tone neutral. "Better than I thought he would, actually. He's opening up. Just a little." Hisashi's eyes sparkled with excitement, but he held back, sensing Aizawa's contemplative mood. "That's great, Sho. I knew he had it in him." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a satisfied look. "So what's got you looking all serious, then? This sounds like good news." Aizawa took another sip of coffee, letting the silence settle between them before speaking. "He seems to be spending a lot of time with Midoriya." They were together in the classroom after the bell, talking, something about hero theory. He trailed off, his gaze distant. "I think they might be becoming friends." Hisashi grinned, his eyes widening with amusement. "Oh, you're kidding. That's fantastic. You know Midoriya is a good influence. He's all heart and determination, kind of like you, if you ever showed a bit more emotion." He winked, earning an eye roll from Aizawa. Aizawa let out a quiet sigh, his expression softening. I know Midoriya is a good kid. I wouldn't have let him into UA otherwise. And I think Hitoshi could use someone like him. Someone who gets it. Gets it? Hisashi echoed, leaning forward. Aizawa nodded, feeling a rare sense of comfort in his friend's words. He took another sip of his now cold coffee, setting down the cup with a sigh. Hisashi was right. He needed to trust Hitoshi to make his own choices, even if that meant letting him explore connections that might change him. And if Midoriya was part of that journey, then perhaps it was time for Aizawa to take a step back, to let Hitoshi build his own world within the walls of UA. He stood up, stretching as he prepared to head back to his duties. Hisashi gave him a mock salute, grinning as he waved him off. Go get him, Eraserhead. And try not to scare all the kids away with that frown of yours. Aizawa huffed, rolling his eyes. It's called maintaining order. Something you should try once in a while. But his tone held no bite, and as he left the lounge, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. Maybe this year would be different, not just for Hitoshi, but for all of them. And if watching over his son's journey brought him even a sliver of peace, then he'd embrace it with the quiet pride of a father who was learning, day by day, what it meant to truly care. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across UA High School's training grounds. As the students of Class 1A gathered for their joint exercise, Aizawa watched with practiced calm, his sharp eyes flicking from one student to another. The exercise was simple but challenging, a combat simulation that would test their ability to work together under pressure, with partners assigned at random. Hitoshi was partnered with Midoriya, a pairing that had Aizawa raising an eyebrow. He knew their quirks weren't the most compatible. Midoriya's physical prowess could easily overwhelm Hitoshi in direct combat, and Hitoshi's brainwashing quirk didn't lend itself to physical confrontation. But that, Aizawa reasoned, was the point of the exercise. UA was built on the idea that even the most mismatched teams could find ways to work together, and he was curious to see how they would approach the challenge. As the simulation began, he leaned back against a railing, crossing his arms as he watched the students dive into the exercise. Explosions and bursts of energy filled the air as they faced off against each other, each team navigating the terrain and obstacles while trying to outmaneuver their opponents. Midoriya and Hitoshi were on the move, communicating in low voices as they quickly assessed the situation. Aizawa could see Hitoshi's mind working, his expression focused, while Midoriya provided commentary on their opponent's possible weaknesses. At one point, Midoriya darted forward, drawing attention to himself as Hitoshi moved into position. It was a clever strategy. Using Midoriya as a decoy allowed Hitoshi to get close enough to activate his brainwashing quirk on one of their opponents. Aizawa watched as Hitoshi's target froze, expression going blank. Within seconds, the match was theirs, ending with Midoriya and Hitoshi standing side by side, breathing hard but victorious. Aizawa felt a surge of pride as he observed their teamwork. Hitoshi's strategy had been sound, but it was their seamless communication that had impressed him most. They hadn't needed to explain every move or spell out each part of the plan. There was a natural rhythm to their partnership, a silent understanding that spoke of trust. Once the simulation ended, the students regrouped, gathering around Aizawa for feedback. He kept his face neutral, offering constructive criticism to each pair in turn, but when he got to Hitoshi and Midoriya, he allowed himself a brief nod of approval. Good work, both of you, he said, his voice steady but holding a note of sincerity. Your approach was well coordinated. Keep building on that. Midoriya's face lit up at the praise, and he glanced at Hitoshi with a grin that seemed to say, we did it. Hitoshi, on the other hand, managed a small smile, a rare display of satisfaction that didn't go unnoticed by Aizawa. He knew how much his son valued positive reinforcement, even if Hitoshi would never admit it out loud. As the students dispersed to gather their things, Aizawa lingered, watching Hitoshi and Midoriya as they fell into easy conversation. They were laughing now, Midoriya saying something animatedly while Hitoshi listened, nodding along with a smirk that seemed almost affectionate. Aizawa felt a strange mix of emotions watching them, a deep pride, a twinge of protectiveness, and a quiet hope that this bond, whatever form it might take, would be something good for Hitoshi. "Shoyuta," came a voice behind him, and Aizawa turned to see All Might approaching, his usual cheerful expression replaced with a thoughtful look. "Your son did well out there. It seems he's finding his place here." Aizawa nodded, his gaze returning to the pair. "He is. More than I expected, honestly." All Might tilted his head, following Aizawa's line of sight to Midoriya and Hitoshi. "Midoriya is quite the influence on his classmates. He has a way of inspiring those around him." Aizawa let out a soft huff of agreement. "He does. I think Hitoshi could use someone like him." He paused, considering his next words carefully. Midoriya has faced his own battles. Maybe that's why Hitoshi feels comfortable with him, like they understand each other in ways most people wouldn't. All Might nodded, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's what makes them such promising young heroes. They bring out the best in each other, pushing each other to grow." Aizawa didn't respond immediately, letting All Might's words sink in. He hadn't thought about it in quite those terms before. He was so used to protecting Hitoshi, to sheltering him from the harsher realities of life, that he sometimes forgot the importance of letting him face the world head-on. Seeing him with Midoriya, working together, laughing, connecting. It was a reminder that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let Hitoshi carve out a space of his own. As All Might left to check on the other students, Aizawa stayed behind, observing from a distance as Hitoshi and Midoriya prepared to leave the training grounds together. Hitoshi glanced back, spotting Aizawa watching, and for a moment, they locked eyes. There was an unspoken understanding between them, an acknowledgement that, no matter where this journey took him, Aizawa would always be there, just a step behind, watching over him. Hitoshi gave a small nod, his expression both serious and grateful. Aizawa inclined his head in return, a silent promise that he'd always be there, supporting him, no matter what. As the two boys disappeared into the distance, Aizawa allowed himself a rare smile. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing for sure, Hitoshi was in good hands. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Chapter 2, First Impressions. Hitoshi walked beside Midoriya, still catching his breath from the training exercise. His pulse was steady now, but the adrenaline hadn't faded completely, leaving him feeling strangely energized. He hadn't expected to enjoy partnering with Midoriya, yet somehow, their synergy had come naturally. It surprised him, especially given how often he tended to prefer working alone. Trusting others wasn't something he did lightly. He'd spent years building walls around himself, and with good reason. Growing up, his quirk had marked him as an outsider, a threat to be feared rather than understood. Brainwashing was a power that unsettled people, a quirk that society deemed villainous, without ever considering the person behind it. But today, as he and Midoriya had faced their opponents, he felt something he hadn't felt often with others, a sense of ease. "Hey, that was really awesome back there," Midoriya said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. His eyes sparkled with genuine excitement, his smile wide and open. "The way you used your quirk so strategically, it made the whole match so much smoother." Hitoshi shrugged, though a small smirk tugged at his lips. "You're the one who drew their attention. I just took advantage of it." Midoriya laughed, scratching the back of his head sheepishly. "Well, it worked, didn't it? That's all that matters." Hitoshi glanced sideways at him, noting the way Midoriya's enthusiasm seemed to radiate from him like an uncontainable energy. He'd heard things about Midoriya, of course. Everyone had. The kid who inherited All Might's legacy, the one who had risen from quirkless to hero in training, through sheer determination and guts. He was someone who inspired people to push harder, to be better versions of themselves. And, Hitoshi realized, he was feeling it too, that urge to be better just from being around him. "Why do you do it?" Hitoshi asked suddenly, surprising even himself with the bluntness of the question. Why are you always so positive? Midoriya blinked, taken aback, and his laughter faded as he considered the question. Honestly? I think it's because I've been where others have been, feeling like I don't belong, feeling weak. I know what it's like to be underestimated, so if I can help even one person feel stronger, then it's worth it. Hitoshi's smirk faded, replaced by a contemplative silence. The sincerity in Midoriya's voice struck a chord within him, something raw and unguarded that he hadn't expected. He'd always assumed Midoriya's optimism was just part of his personality, an unbreakable cheerfulness that seemed to defy logic. But now, seeing this side of him, Hitoshi felt an odd sense of understanding, of kinship. You don't think my quirk's dangerous, then? He asked, almost as a challenge. Midoriya looked at him, his expression serious. I think every quirk has the potential to be dangerous, depending on how it's used. But I also believe that a hero isn't defined by their quirk. It's their heart, their actions, that matter. The words hung in the air, and Hitoshi felt a slight warmth creeping into his chest, a feeling he quickly pushed down. Compliments and reassurance were things he didn't typically know how to respond to, let alone accept. But coming from Midoriya, they felt genuine. Real. Thanks, he said quietly, his voice barely above a murmur. He wasn't used to saying that, but for once, it didn't feel forced. It felt right. Midoriya beamed, and Hitoshi couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. It was rare for him to find someone who didn't see his quirk as a threat or treat him with a hint of suspicion. But with Midoriya, he felt like he was just Hitoshi, another kid trying to make his way through UA High. They continued walking, the silence between them comfortable, punctuated by the sounds of their classmates chatting in the distance. As they reached the exit of the training grounds, Midoriya looked over at him, his expression thoughtful. You know, he started, his voice hesitant, I think you're a lot stronger than you realize, Hitoshi. Not just because of your quirk, but because of who you are. Hitoshi froze, his mind grappling with the weight of the words. Midoriya's unwavering confidence was something he admired but couldn't quite understand. His own life had been shaped by proving himself, by constantly trying to convince others, and himself, that he was worthy of this path. But hearing Midoriya say it so simply, without any doubt or hesitation, made him feel something. Something warm and unsettling, something he wasn't sure he wanted to examine too closely. I don't know if I believe that yet, Hitoshi admitted, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground. But, maybe someday. Midoriya smiled softly, a gentle and understanding expression. That's all you need. You have time and you have people who believe in you. Myself included. For a moment, they stood there in silence, each lost in their thoughts. It was strange, Hitoshi mused, how quickly things could change. Only a few months ago, he'd been training with Aizawa, convinced that he'd always be on the outside looking in. But here he was, sharing a quiet moment with someone who saw past his quirk, who saw him as he was. As they parted ways, Hitoshi felt a sense of gratitude that he couldn't quite put into words. He watched as Midoriya walked off, his usual enthusiastic stride taking him toward the main building, where his other friends awaited him. A small smile crept onto Hitoshi's face, and for once, he didn't try to hide it. He'd always believed that the path of a hero would be one he'd have to walk alone. But maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong. Here's Chapter 2, Part 2 of Shadows and Sparks, shifting to Midoriya's perspective as he reflects on his growing bond with Hitoshi. Midoriya hurried along the path back to the school building, replaying the conversation he'd just had with Hitoshi in his mind. He couldn't quite explain it, but something about their exchange felt different. Over the past few weeks, he'd seen glimpses of Hitoshi's strength and intelligence, but today he'd gotten a peek behind the mask Hitoshi usually wore, a rare, honest moment that felt like a glimpse into the person beneath. Hitoshi had a reputation for being reserved, and Midoriya knew the struggle that came with a quirk that others viewed as dangerous. It reminded him of the way he'd been treated before he'd gotten his own quirk, the way people used to look at him as if he were fragile or incomplete. But Hitoshi, he didn't seem broken. He seemed powerful, capable. And, Midoriya realized, he admired that. Lost in thought, he made his way to the outdoor area where a few of his friends were eating lunch. Uraraka waved him over, grinning as he approached. "Deku. We saved you a spot." He returned her smile, grateful for the warmth of his friends, but his mind was still partially on Hitoshi. He took his seat between Uraraka and Ida, trying to refocus on the conversation around him, but it was hard not to notice how quiet Hitoshi had been today. Normally, Hitoshi kept to himself during breaks, often finding a secluded spot to avoid crowds. But today had been different. Today, he'd chosen to spend time with Midoriya, even if only for a little while. "Deku, are you okay?" Uraraka's concerned voice broke through his thoughts, and he blinked, startled. "Oh. Sorry, yeah," he said quickly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just thinking about something." Ida, who was taking a meticulous bite of his sandwich, nodded in understanding. It's understandable to feel pensive after a rigorous training session. "You did well out there today, Midoriya. I saw how you and Hitoshi coordinated your efforts, it was impressive teamwork." Midoriya felt a flush of pride at Ida's words, though he tried to brush it off. "Thanks, Ida. Honestly, I think Hitoshi did most of the work. His strategy made everything a lot easier." "Shinsou?" Todoroki, who had been sitting nearby, looked over with mild curiosity. "He's smart. I'd expect nothing less from him." Midoriya nodded, his thoughts drifting back to their conversation after training. He hadn't known what to expect from Hitoshi at first. He'd only heard the stories, most of which painted Hitoshi as an aloof, distant figure. But Hitoshi wasn't distant, at least not in the way people thought. He was careful. He was the kind of person who seemed to weigh every word, every action, and only gave pieces of himself to those he trusted. He wondered if Hitoshi would let him in, even a little. There was something about him that Midoriya felt drawn to, a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. Maybe it was respect, or maybe it was something else. Whatever it was, it made him want to understand Hitoshi better, to figure out the thoughts and motivations that lay behind his calm, unreadable expression. "Earth to Deku." Uraraka's voice was teasing this time, and he looked up to see her smirking at him. "You're really zoned out today. Are you sure you're not thinking about something else?" A blush crept onto his cheeks, and he shook his head. "It's nothing like that. I was just thinking about training." She laughed, nudging him playfully. "If you say so. You and Shinsou seem to make a good team, though. It's nice to see him opening up a little." Midoriya nodded, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. "Yeah, I think he's just misunderstood. He's been through a lot, and I guess I kind of get it." They fell into an easy silence, eating lunch while listening to the conversations around them. Midoriya couldn't help but glance back toward the training grounds, wondering if Hitoshi was still there. He knew Hitoshi liked to take his time after training, lingering when others had already left, as if savoring the quiet. It was a habit he could understand. UA was a noisy, bustling place, and sometimes the quiet spaces were the best places to breathe. Just as he was finishing his lunch, he noticed Hitoshi walking toward the building, hands in his pockets, looking every bit like the calm, confident figure Midoriya had come to admire. He watched as Hitoshi walked past the cluster of students, his expression neutral, but his posture relaxed. For a moment, their eyes met across the courtyard, and Midoriya felt his heart skip a beat. There was something in Hitoshi's gaze, something guarded yet curious, as if he was assessing Midoriya, trying to figure out what made him tick. It was a look that seemed to hold both respect and a hint of challenge, and Midoriya felt a flicker of excitement in response. It wasn't often that someone looked at him that way. He was used to people seeing him as the enthusiastic, somewhat reckless kid, always eager to prove himself. But Hitoshi's gaze was different. It felt like he was looking at Midoriya, really seeing him. As Hitoshi turned to head inside, Midoriya couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in his chest. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he knew one thing for certain: he wanted to see more of Hitoshi. He wanted to understand the person beneath the calm exterior, the one who had survived so much and still managed to stand tall. There was a strength there, a resilience that fascinated him, and he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to get closer, to see the parts of Hitoshi that he kept hidden from the world. He finished his lunch in thoughtful silence, barely hearing his friend's conversation as he mulled over the day's events. Whatever this connection with Hitoshi was, he knew he didn't want it to fade. He wanted to nurture it, to give it the time and space it needed to grow. With a quiet determination, Midoriya resolved to make the effort. After all, he'd fought for so much already in his life, this, he decided, would be no different. And if Hitoshi would let him, he'd be there, one friend, maybe something more, in a world that was still too quick to judge. Hitoshi found a quiet corner of the school's gardens, a place he'd discovered during his first week at UA. It was tucked away behind one of the older buildings, overgrown with ivy and shaded by tall trees, a spot most students overlooked in their rush between classes and training. Here, he could find a rare moment of peace, away from the noise and energy that filled the halls. He leaned back against a tree, letting his gaze drift over the leaves shifting in the gentle breeze. The quiet was soothing, grounding him after the whirlwind of the training session and his conversation with Midoriya. He hadn't expected today to go the way it had. Partnering with Midoriya had brought a rush of new thoughts and emotions, feelings he wasn't entirely prepared for but couldn't ignore. He replayed their conversation in his mind, feeling a strange warmth at Midoriya's words. I think you're a lot stronger than you realize, Hitoshi. Not just because of your quirk, but because of who you are. No one had ever said anything like that to him. Most people saw his quirk before they saw him, the person behind the power. To them, he was his brainwashing quirk first and Hitoshi second. But Midoriya hadn't looked at him that way. Midoriya had spoken to him as if he were normal. As if his quirk was just one small part of who he was, rather than the defining aspect of his identity. Hitoshi let out a quiet sigh, running a hand through his hair as he considered what that meant. He hadn't made friends easily in his life. Trust wasn't something he gave freely, and people didn't often offer it to him either. But Midoriya was different. Midoriya had seen something in him worth trusting, worth respecting, and it had caught him off guard. A part of him wondered why he felt so drawn to Midoriya. It wasn't just that Midoriya was kind, he'd met kind people before, though most kept their distance once they learned what he could do. No, it was something deeper, something about the way Midoriya seemed to understand the world, not through rose-colored glasses but with a determination that bordered on defiance. Midoriya had fought his way to UA, struggled to prove he belonged just as Hitoshi had, and yet he carried himself with a warmth that Hitoshi found strangely comforting. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching until Midoriya was nearly beside him. Startled, he straightened, his usual mask of nonchalance slipping into place as he turned to face Midoriya. Hey! Midoriya greeted him, smiling a little sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his neck. I saw you come over here. Didn't mean to intrude, just wondered if you wanted some company? Hitoshi hesitated, the reflexive part of him wanting to turn Midoriya away, to retreat into the comfortable solitude he'd grown used to. But something held him back, a quiet urge to say yes, to let Midoriya stay. Sure, he replied, his voice carefully casual. He gestured to the spot beside him. It's quiet here. Figured you'd be with your friends, though. Midoriya shrugged, taking a seat on the grass beside him. Yeah, they're all in the courtyard. But I thought maybe you'd want some company, too. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that Hitoshi was finding himself craving more often than he realized. He glanced at Midoriya out of the corner of his eye, noticing the way he seemed content just to sit there, saying nothing, as if he understood that sometimes words weren't necessary. It was a rare thing, he thought, to find someone who could sit in silence without feeling the need to fill it with small talk. "Why did you come here, Midoriya?" he asked after a moment, his voice low but genuine. "Most people don't seek me out. They tend to avoid me." Midoriya looked at him, surprise flashing across his face, before he settled into a thoughtful expression. "Well, I don't think I'm most people," he said, smiling softly. "And I don't know. I just feel like there's more to you than what people see. Like there's a lot that maybe you don't show anyone, but it's still there, and I guess I wanted to know that side of you, if you'd let me." The words hit Hitoshi harder than he expected, and he found himself at a loss for a response. He'd always been careful with his emotions, keeping people at arm's length as a form of self-preservation. But here was Midoriya, openly offering his friendship, willing to accept him without conditions or expectations. It was a kindness that Hitoshi wasn't sure he deserved, but it was one he found himself wanting. "Maybe," he murmured, unable to keep the vulnerability from his voice. "Maybe I'll let you, if you're really that interested." Midoriya's smile widened, his eyes lighting up with that familiar spark of determination. "I am. I think we could make a good team, you know?" Hitoshi allowed himself a small smile, feeling an unfamiliar warmth settle in his chest. "You're persistent, aren't you?" "I've been called worse," Midoriya replied, chuckling. "But yeah, I guess I am. I think sometimes you just have to be, you know?" Hitoshi nodded, his gaze drifting back to the trees. He understood persistence, understood the need to keep pushing forward, even when the world seemed set against you. And maybe, with Midoriya by his side, that path wouldn't feel quite as lonely. They stayed there for a while, just sitting in the quiet shade of the trees, each lost in their own thoughts, but comforted by the other's presence. Hitoshi didn't know what the future held or where this budding friendship would lead, but he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility, of hope. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 3, The Spark Ignites. Aizawa leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze sweeping over the training ground from his vantage point on the observation deck. The day's lesson focused on agility and control, two critical components for any hero. He watched each of his students navigate the obstacle course, analyzing their strengths, weaknesses, and how they adapted to the physical and mental demands of the training. But his attention kept drifting to one particular pair, Hitoshi and Midoriya. He hadn't planned on pairing them again, but after seeing how well they'd handled themselves last time, he decided to put them together once more, curious to see if that synergy was more than just a fluke. And so far, they hadn't disappointed him. Their approach was different this time, more relaxed, more fluid. Hitoshi had taken a more proactive role, guiding Midoriya through some of the more challenging obstacles, with surprising confidence. Midoriya, in turn, had fallen into step beside him, following his lead without question. Aizawa noted the subtle shift in their dynamic with interest. Hitoshi had always been cautious, methodical, and often preferred working alone rather than placing trust in others. But with Midoriya, that hesitation seemed to fade, replaced by a calm assurance that Aizawa hadn't often seen in his son. And Midoriya seemed to be thriving, too. His usual enthusiasm was tempered by a quiet focus, a respect for Hitoshi's approach that balanced out his own impulsive tendencies. It was a rare balance, and Aizawa couldn't deny the satisfaction it brought him to see it. Just as he was jotting down a few notes on their progress, he heard a familiar voice beside him. "They're quite the pair, aren't they?" Aizawa didn't need to look up to know it was Hisashi. His friend had an uncanny ability to pop up whenever he least expected it, always with that trademark grin and boundless energy. Hisashi leaned over the railing, watching the students with his usual enthusiasm. "They are," Aizawa replied, his voice steady. "Hitoshi's opening up more than I thought he would. Especially with Midoriya." Hisashi nodded, crossing his arms as he studied the two boys weaving through the obstacles. "I told you, Midoriya's got that effect on people. He makes them feel seen, heard. It's like he's got this. I dunno, this way of making everyone feel like they matter. Aizawa grunted in agreement, though he wouldn't have put it quite so sentimentally. Midoriya did have a way of seeing beyond the surface, of understanding people in a way that was rare for someone his age. It was one of the reasons Aizawa had believed in him from the start, despite the risks and challenges that came with his quirk. And now, watching him and Hitoshi together, Aizawa felt that belief reaffirmed. He's good for Hitoshi, Aizawa admitted, his voice barely above a murmur. It's a relief, seeing him connect with someone who understands him. Hisashi shot him a knowing look. And you're proud of him, aren't you? Aizawa didn't answer, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was a quiet, understated pride, the kind he kept close to his chest, but it was there, undeniable and steady. He'd always been proud of Hitoshi, but seeing him navigate friendships, connections, and trust on his own terms was a different kind of pride, a deeper one. They're coming this way, Hisashi pointed out, nudging him. You better look neutral, or they'll think you actually have emotions. Aizawa shot him a dry look but straightened up, his face settling back into its usual unreadable expression just as Hitoshi and Midoriya finished the course, both looking slightly winded but satisfied. Midoriya grinned as he spotted the teachers, raising a hand in a casual wave. Sensei, he called, his voice carrying across the training ground. How was that? Did we make good time? Aizawa allowed himself a brief nod of approval. Good work, both of you. Your timing was excellent, and your coordination was strong. Keep it up. Midoriya's face lit up with pride, and he looked to Hitoshi, who managed a small smile in response. Aizawa noted the way Midoriya's presence seemed to relax Hitoshi, the subtle ease that washed over him in Midoriya's company. It was a rare sight, one that stirred something almost protective in him. Thanks, Sensei, Hitoshi replied, his voice calm but carrying a hint of something Aizawa rarely heard, satisfaction. We're still working on some things, but it felt good. Hisashi leaned forward, grinning. And it shows. You two make a great team. Keep supporting each other like this, and you'll go far. As they headed toward the lockers to change, Aizawa let his gaze linger on them for a moment longer, something thoughtful settling in his chest. He was used to being watchful, protective, ensuring that Hitoshi had the space to find his way without too much interference. But now, he realized, perhaps it was time to let go a little more, to let Hitoshi grow and form his own connections, even if those connections carried the risks and complications of friendship. He was still getting used to this feeling, the unfamiliar tug of fatherly pride mixed with a hint of apprehension. Letting someone in was always a risk, especially for someone like Hitoshi, who had learned early to rely on himself. But watching them, Aizawa knew it was worth it. Midoriya was exactly the kind of friend Hitoshi needed, a grounding presence with a tenacity that matched his own. And if their bond grew stronger, if it evolved into something more, Aizawa would be there, quietly watching, offering his support as best he could. As Hisashi continued to chat beside him, Aizawa found himself wondering what the future held for the two boys, and for Hitoshi in particular. Whatever it was, he was prepared to stand by him, as always. And for now, that was enough. Hitoshi stepped into the quiet of the locker room, the faint hum of the ventilation system the only sound around him. After the intensity of the training session, the silence was a welcome reprieve. He took a deep breath, still buzzing with the adrenaline of their successful run through the course. He could feel the lingering satisfaction of his performance, of working seamlessly alongside Midoriya. It wasn't just about the victory, it was about the way they'd fallen into step so naturally, each understanding the other's movements, almost like they'd trained together for years. He wasn't sure he'd ever felt that with anyone before. As he began to change, he noticed the door swing open, and Midoriya stepped in, flashing him that bright, easygoing smile. Hey! Midoriya said, heading toward the locker next to him. You did awesome out there, Hitoshi. Your strategy was perfect. Hitoshi felt a faint blush rise to his cheeks, and he quickly turned his focus to his locker, hoping Midoriya wouldn't notice. He wasn't used to this, someone offering such open praise, not because of his quirk or the tactics he could bring to the table, but because they genuinely saw him as a capable teammate. Thanks, he muttered, keeping his tone neutral, but unable to hide the slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You weren't bad yourself, Midoriya. Couldn't have done it without you as the distraction. Midoriya laughed, leaning back against his locker. Well, I guess I'm pretty good at that, huh? Being the distraction, I mean. Yeah, Hitoshi replied, a little more softly. But you're more than that. You're good at, well, bringing people together. He hadn't meant to say that, hadn't planned on letting something so honest slip out. But the words were there, unbidden and raw, and as soon as he spoke, he felt the weight of their truth settle between them. Midoriya's expression softened, and Hitoshi could see the way his eyes sparkled with gratitude. Thanks, Hitoshi, he said quietly. That means a lot. Hitoshi's gaze drifted down to his locker, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to this kind of connection, this openness. His life had been shaped by caution, by walls he'd built around himself, and he was still learning what it meant to let someone in. They changed in silence for a few minutes, the quiet comfortable, until Midoriya spoke again. Hey, so, he began, almost hesitantly, I was wondering if you'd want to come to lunch with me and the others sometime? Uraraka, Ida, Todoroki, they're all nice, and I think you'd get along with them. Hitoshi felt a pang of hesitation. He wasn't sure he was ready for that, being part of a group, putting himself out there in a way that made him vulnerable to judgment. But then he looked at Midoriya, who was watching him with that earnest, hopeful expression, and he felt something shift inside him. I'll think about it, he said finally, his voice low but sincere. Not used to big groups, you know? Midoriya nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. Yeah, I get that. Take your time. But if you ever feel like joining, we'd be happy to have you. Hitoshi found himself nodding, and for the first time, he considered it. Maybe he would join them, not just to be around Midoriya, but to see what it felt like to be part of something. The idea was strange, a little unsettling, but there was something about it that felt right. As they left the locker room, Midoriya gave him a gentle nudge, smiling. Hey, thanks for trusting me out there today. I know that doesn't come easy. Hitoshi glanced at him, a small smile playing on his lips. Don't get used to it, Midoriya, he teased, though there was no real bite in his voice. Just because we work well together, doesn't mean you're special. Midoriya chuckled, unfazed. I'll take what I can get. They walked together down the hallway, side by side, and for the first time, Hitoshi felt a sense of ease he hadn't expected. He didn't know where this path would take him, didn't fully understand the depth of his feelings for Midoriya. But he knew one thing for certain, he wanted to find out. And for now, that was enough. As Midoriya walked down the hall beside Hitoshi, he found himself glancing over at him more often than he'd planned, his mind buzzing with thoughts he couldn't quite organize. There was something about Hitoshi that intrigued him, something that went beyond their natural teamwork and understanding. Hitoshi was different. Calm and collected in a way that Midoriya wasn't, but also complex, a depth of emotions and thoughts hidden beneath his steady exterior. Something on your mind? Hitoshi asked, arching an eyebrow as he caught Midoriya's lingering stare. Oh. Sorry, yeah, Midoriya stammered, looking away with a blush. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. I was just thinking about, well, you. And how I'm glad we got paired up today. It feels like I'm learning a lot from you. Hitoshi chuckled, his lips curving into a slight smile. I could say the same. You have this way of diving in headfirst, and somehow, it works. It's impressive, really. Midoriya laughed, a bit sheepishly. Guess I can't help it. Sometimes, I just feel like I have to act fast, especially when it's important. You seem to have a different approach, though. More methodical. Hitoshi nodded, his gaze drifting down the hallway. It's how I learned to get by, I guess. Growing up, I had to be careful. People would get the wrong idea about me because of my quirk, so I learned to stay one step ahead. Made it easier to avoid trouble. Midoriya felt a pang of empathy, the weight of those words settling over him. He understood, to a degree, the loneliness that came from feeling like the world saw you as something different, something other. Even now, despite his progress, he occasionally felt like he had to prove himself over and over. Hearing Hitoshi talk about it with such calm acceptance struck a chord in him, a reminder of the strength it took to keep going despite the odds. They walked in silence for a few moments before Midoriya spoke up again, his voice quieter this time. I think it's really admirable, Hitoshi. You've come so far, and I think a lot of people could learn from you. Hitoshi shot him a sideways glance, a flicker of surprise in his usually calm expression. Thanks, Midoriya, he said, and Midoriya could hear the sincerity in his voice. I'm not used to hearing that, but it means a lot. Midoriya felt his heart beat a little faster, a warmth spreading through his chest at the soft gratitude in Hitoshi's tone. He wanted to say more, to tell Hitoshi just how much he valued their connection, but he wasn't sure how to put it into words. Instead, he settled for a smile, hoping it would convey at least part of what he was feeling. They reached the door to their next class, where they'd have to part ways, and Midoriya hesitated for a moment. He found himself reluctant to leave, the thought of going back to his usual routine without Hitoshi beside him strangely disappointing. He'd spent so much time with Hitoshi today, gotten used to his steady presence, and the idea of being apart, even for a few hours, left an unexpected emptiness in his chest. Well, guess I'll see you after class, Hitoshi said, his voice casual, but carrying a hint of something unspoken. Yeah, Midoriya replied, feeling his cheeks warm. Maybe, we can meet up later? I mean, for training or something? Hitoshi's lips curved into a small smile. Sure. Just let me know when. With one last nod, Hitoshi headed off down the hallway, leaving Midoriya standing by the door, watching him go. As he turned to head inside, he felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within him, excitement, curiosity, and something else he couldn't quite identify. He wasn't sure where this connection with Hitoshi would lead, but he knew one thing for certain, he wanted to find out. Midoriya took a deep breath, bracing himself for the rest of the day. He'd wait for that next chance to train with Hitoshi, to keep building this friendship that felt like it had the potential to become something far more meaningful. And maybe, if he was lucky, he'd get the chance to see Hitoshi let down his guard, even just a little more. As he walked into the classroom, he found himself smiling, the warmth of anticipation making his steps just a bit lighter. Chapter 4, Growing Closer. Aizawa leaned against the wall outside the training gym, arms crossed, as he watched Hitoshi and Midoriya spar on the mat. Their session was technically over, but the two had stayed behind, taking the opportunity to work together without the usual pressure of an audience. Aizawa had seen plenty of pairings come and go in Class 1A, students forming friendships and rivalries as they trained. But with Hitoshi and Midoriya, something was different, more genuine, more invested. It was as if they brought out a better version of each other, each pushing the other to grow in unexpected ways. Midoriya lunged forward, launching a quick but controlled punch, which Hitoshi countered with a smooth sidestep and pivot. They moved together with a kind of synergy that felt almost instinctive, and Aizawa couldn't help but be impressed by how naturally they adapted to each other's movements. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just fluid coordination. Even without the shared experience and background that many of the other students had, Hitoshi and Midoriya operated on a wavelength that most pairs in Class 1A took months to reach, if they ever reached it at all. As he observed, Aizawa noticed small details, like how Midoriya slowed his pace ever so slightly to match Hitoshi's, or how Hitoshi would give Midoriya subtle nods to confirm their next moves. He felt a strange sense of pride, a warm satisfaction that he wasn't used to. Hitoshi had always been guarded, cautious, careful with his words and actions. But around Midoriya, those walls seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of ease that Aizawa hadn't seen before. He wasn't the only one who had noticed. Across the gym, Hitoshi stood watching, grinning in his typical, enthusiastic way. He'd been supportive from the start, encouraging Aizawa to let Hitoshi open up, to trust that he'd find his place among his classmates. And now, seeing Hitoshi and Midoriya spar, Hitoshi shot Aizawa a knowing look that clearly said, "I told you so." Aizawa sighed, glancing back at the pair as they wrapped up the match, both slightly winded but smiling. Midoriya said something, his expression brightening as he laughed, and Hitoshi responded with a smirk, shaking his head as if amused by whatever Midoriya had said. They seemed to forget, for a moment, that they weren't alone. Hitoshi nudged Aizawa, his grin widening. "They're pretty close, huh?" Aizawa shrugged, feigning indifference, though his gaze remained on them. "They get along well. That's what matters." Hitoshi raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Oh, come on, show. Don't pretend you don't see it. I've known you long enough to know when you're invested." Aizawa sighed, deciding there was no point in denying it. Hitoshi had always been able to see through him. "I do see it. And, yeah, I'm proud of him." This is new for Hitoshi, he doesn't let people in easily. "Maybe he just needed to find someone who sees him for who he is," Hitoshi replied, his tone softer than usual. "Midoriya is good for him, show. You know that as well as I do." Aizawa nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Hitoshi's words. It was strange, feeling this blend of pride and protectiveness. Hitoshi was strong, independent, but Aizawa couldn't shake the instinct to look out for him, to make sure he was safe. And Midoriya, well, he was a good influence. But Aizawa knew the weight that came with close connections, how they could be both a source of strength and a vulnerability. As if sensing their conversation, Midoriya looked over and waved, his face lighting up when he spotted them watching. He nudged Hitoshi, who glanced over, his usual cool expression softening slightly when he saw Aizawa and Hitoshi. Aizawa gave them a curt nod, his way of acknowledging their efforts, and Hitoshi responded with a small, almost shy nod of his own. "See?" Hitoshi murmured, chuckling. "He's opening up more than you thought he would. I think he trusts Midoriya, show. That's a big step." "Yeah," Aizawa agreed, his voice low. "I just hope. I hope it doesn't backfire." Hitoshi clapped him on the shoulder, his gaze reassuring. "Hey, they're both strong, and they've got you watching out for them. I think they'll be just fine. Besides," he added with a grin, "sometimes, you have to let go a little. Give him room to grow. You've taught him well." Aizawa glanced back at the two boys as they started to gather their things, chatting easily as they packed up. He could see the spark between them, the trust that had been built over the past few weeks. And for once, Aizawa allowed himself to feel a quiet optimism, a hope that maybe, just maybe, this connection would be something good for both of them. Whatever the future held, Aizawa knew he would be there, watching from a distance, ready to support them both as they found their way. For now, he'd let them have this moment, let them grow and strengthen each other. And as he and Hitoshi left the gym, Aizawa felt a small, satisfied smile tug at his lips, a rare but genuine expression of pride in his son. Hitoshi leaned against the cool tile of the hallway just outside the gym, a water bottle in one hand, as he watched Midoriya animatedly recount their sparring session. His friend's excitement was infectious, spilling out in gestures and enthusiastic explanations that made Hitoshi's lips tug into a small smile despite himself. He hadn't anticipated that sparring together would feel so natural. "And then when you sidestepped, it was perfect timing," Midoriya was saying, his hands waving in the air. "Honestly, Hitoshi, I don't think I've ever felt this in sync with someone during training." Hitoshi raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of water as he processed Midoriya's words. The admission caught him off guard, but he understood the sentiment. Somehow, when they trained together, things just fell into place. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just a shared instinct, a rhythm that felt right. "Yeah, I guess we do make a decent team," Hitoshi replied, his tone light but with an undercurrent of sincerity. Midoriya beamed, his expression brightening with that signature openness Hitoshi had come to appreciate. It wasn't that he hadn't met kind people before, but Midoriya's kindness was different. It wasn't simply politeness or courtesy, it was genuine, almost as if Midoriya was determined to see the best in everyone, including him. "So, how did you get so good at reading movements?" Midoriya asked, shifting topics with a curiosity that seemed endless. "I mean, you always know the exact moment to move, almost like you can read people's intentions." Hitoshi shrugged, feeling a bit self-conscious under Midoriya's focused attention. "Just practice, I guess. When you have a quirk like mine, people tend to look at you a certain way. You learn to anticipate what they're thinking." Midoriya's expression softened, a look of understanding that made Hitoshi feel both exposed and oddly comforted. He wasn't used to talking about his quirk like this, to someone who didn't see it as a threat or a liability. But with Midoriya, the weight of his usual defenses seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet relief he hadn't expected. "Honestly, I think that's amazing," Midoriya said, his voice warm with admiration. "Not just the quirk, but how you've handled it, how you've taken something people might fear and turned it into something powerful. I really respect that, Hitoshi." Hitoshi felt his cheeks heat up slightly, and he quickly turned his gaze to the floor, hoping Midoriya wouldn't notice. Compliments weren't something he knew how to handle, especially not ones as heartfelt as this. But somehow, coming from Midoriya, they felt right. "Thanks," he muttered, keeping his voice steady despite the warmth spreading in his chest. I don't hear that very often." Midoriya's eyes softened, and Hitoshi could see the sincerity in his gaze. "Well, you deserve to hear it. You've worked hard to be here, and I think it's really inspiring." They fell into a comfortable silence, leaning against the wall side by side. For a moment, Hitoshi found himself glancing over at Midoriya, studying the way his friend's face softened in quiet moments like this. Midoriya wasn't like anyone else he'd met. He didn't try to fix him or change him. He just accepted him. "Why do you do it, though?" Hitoshi found himself asking, the words slipping out before he could think better of it. "Why are you always so nice to people?" Midoriya looked at him, a bit taken aback, but there was no hesitation in his answer. "Because I've been there, you know? I know what it's like to feel different, to feel like you're not good enough. And I don't ever want anyone to feel that way if I can help it." Hitoshi felt something shift inside him, a strange sense of vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear those words, how much they resonated with the loneliness he'd carried for so long. But here, with Midoriya, that loneliness didn't seem as heavy. It felt shared. "Thanks, Midoriya," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Really? You make it easier." Midoriya smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes, full of warmth and understanding. "I'm glad, Hitoshi. And you make it easier for me, too." They stood there for a moment, the silence filled with unspoken thoughts and feelings that neither of them seemed ready to voice. Hitoshi wasn't sure what this connection was, but he knew it was different, something he hadn't felt before. It was a feeling of trust, of safety, that made him want to hold on to it, to protect it. And as they left the gym together, walking side by side down the hallway, Hitoshi felt something close to hope, a quiet, steady warmth that reminded him that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. Midoriya walked down the hallway beside Hitoshi, his mind still buzzing with their conversation and the training session they'd just completed. There was something different about Hitoshi, something that drew him in with a quiet intensity that felt both comforting and intriguing. It was rare for him to find someone who understood what it was like to feel like an outsider, and somehow, Hitoshi seemed to understand that part of him without needing an explanation. As they walked, Midoriya snuck a glance at Hitoshi, taking in the calm, thoughtful expression on his face. Hitoshi had a quiet strength, a steadiness that balanced out Midoriya's own high energy. And it wasn't just about training or teamwork, there was a genuine respect and understanding between them that Midoriya hadn't expected but was beginning to value deeply. "You okay?" Hitoshi's voice pulled him out of his thoughts, and Midoriya blinked, realizing he'd been staring. "Oh. Yeah, sorry," he stammered, feeling heat rise to his cheeks. He gave an embarrassed laugh, scratching the back of his head. "I was just thinking about our training. It's nice to have someone who really understands strategy, you know?" Hitoshi smirked, his usual guarded expression softening slightly. "Same here. I'm not usually one for team exercises, but you make it easy." The words sent a thrill through Midoriya, and he couldn't help but smile. It wasn't often he heard Hitoshi speak with that level of openness, and it made him feel like he was seeing a part of him that no one else got to see. The realization was both exciting and a little terrifying. This wasn't just a friendship, he realized, it was something more, something that made his heart beat faster and his thoughts race in ways he wasn't used to. They reached the fork in the hallway where they'd have to part ways for their next classes, and Midoriya hesitated, not wanting the moment to end. He glanced at Hitoshi, feeling a sudden urge to say something more, something that would capture what he was feeling. "Hey, Hitoshi," he started, his voice softening. "Thanks for today. Really. It means a lot to me, getting to train with you." Hitoshi gave him a small nod, his gaze steady. "It means a lot to me, too." They stood there for a moment, the unspoken words lingering in the air between them. Midoriya wanted to say more, wanted to reach out and make sure Hitoshi knew just how much he appreciated him. But the words felt too big, too risky, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what they meant. Instead, he settled for a smile, hoping it would convey everything he couldn't put into words. "Well, I'll see you later," he said, forcing himself to turn and head toward his classroom. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something unsaid, something important. He found himself already looking forward to their next training session, already thinking about the next chance he'd have to spend time with Hitoshi. There was a warmth in his chest that hadn't been there before, a quiet but persistent feeling that made him want to be around Hitoshi more than anyone else. And as he slipped into his seat in the classroom, he allowed himself a moment to acknowledge it. This was more than friendship. It was a connection he hadn't expected, a bond that was becoming one of the most important things in his life. Whatever this was, he knew he wanted it to grow, to see where it might lead. For now, he'd keep it to himself, letting it simmer quietly in his heart. But he knew that one day, soon, he'd have to tell Hitoshi, he'd have to let him know just how much he meant to him. And for the first time, the thought of taking that step didn't feel so daunting. It felt right. Chapter 5, Parental Instincts. Aizawa watched Hitoshi and Midoriya sparring from his usual spot on the observation deck, arms folded as he analyzed their movements. It had become a routine by now, the way the two of them trained together whenever they could, pushing each other in ways that Aizawa hadn't seen with other students. It was clear to him, and to anyone paying close enough attention, that they'd developed a bond that went beyond mere friendship. There was a quiet intensity in the way they worked together, a trust and understanding that was unspoken yet unmistakable. It was evident in the way Hitoshi didn't hesitate to let Midoriya take risks, trusting him to handle himself, and in how Midoriya would instinctively shift his stance to match Hitoshi's, adapting to his rhythm as if they'd been training together for years. Aizawa could see the connection between them growing with each session, and while part of him was proud, another part of him couldn't ignore the pang of protectiveness that tugged at his chest. "They're good together, huh?" Hitoshi's voice broke his train of thought, and Aizawa turned to see his friend leaning against the railing, watching the pair with a smile. I gotta say, I've never seen Hitoshi this invested. Aizawa nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He's never let anyone get this close before. It's new for him. New for you, too, isn't it? Hisashi chuckled softly, giving Aizawa a knowing look. Seeing him open up, letting someone in like this. I bet it's a little scary, huh? Aizawa didn't respond immediately, his gaze returning to the two boys on the training floor. It was true, he wasn't used to seeing Hitoshi like this, so unguarded, so willing to be vulnerable. He'd spent years teaching Hitoshi to be cautious, to protect himself from the judgments and misunderstandings that often came with his quirk. But now, watching him with Midoriya, Aizawa felt a strange mixture of pride and worry. Yeah, it is, he admitted quietly. He's strong, but letting someone in means letting yourself be vulnerable. And with everything he's been through, I just want to make sure he doesn't get hurt. Hisashi nodded, his expression softening. That's fair. But Midoriya is a good kid. He's not the type to hurt anyone, least of all someone he cares about. Aizawa sighed, crossing his arms tighter. I know. It's not that I don't trust Midoriya. It's the risk that comes with caring about people. Hitoshi has always been careful, always guarded. But now, he's starting to open up, and I just don't want him to get blindsided. Hisashi chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. That's part of life, We all get hurt eventually. But you've given Hitoshi the tools to handle it. He's stronger than you think, and he's got you in his corner. He'll be okay. Aizawa gave a small nod, his gaze lingering on Hitoshi as he dodged one of Midoriya's attacks, countering with a precise move that showed just how much he'd grown. Hisashi was right, Hitoshi had strength and resilience that Aizawa admired. He'd watched his son overcome so much, and yet, seeing him navigate something as personal and unpredictable as this connection with Midoriya brought a new level of vulnerability that Aizawa couldn't ignore. The training session wrapped up, and Hitoshi and Midoriya made their way toward the exit, still talking animatedly, the ease between them evident in their relaxed smiles and shared laughter. Aizawa felt a sense of pride swell in his chest, watching Hitoshi find someone who genuinely seemed to understand him. As they walked past, Hitoshi glanced up, catching Aizawa's eye with a look that was both questioning and reassuring. There was a silent understanding there, a reassurance that he was okay, that he knew what he was doing. Aizawa gave a brief nod in response, letting him know, without words, that he was proud, that he was watching and would always be there if Hitoshi needed him. When the boys had left, Hisashi looked at Aizawa with a grin. You've done a pretty amazing job with him. Hitoshi's lucky to have you. Aizawa let out a quiet sigh, a rare softness in his eyes. I'm the lucky one, Hisashi. He's everything I could have hoped for. They stood in silence for a moment, Aizawa letting the weight of those words settle. He'd spent years guiding Hitoshi, teaching him, protecting him, but now, watching him step into his own, Aizawa knew it was time to let go just a little, to let Hitoshi make his own choices, his own connections. And though the future was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure, whatever path Hitoshi chose, he would always be there, watching over him, offering his support from the sidelines. For now, he'd trust that the foundation they'd built together was strong enough to carry Hitoshi forward, even into uncharted territory. And he'd be ready to catch him if he ever fell. Hitoshi found himself walking alongside Midoriya down one of UA's quieter corridors, the noise of the training area fading as they moved farther away. He was still a little out of breath from their latest sparring session, but it wasn't the physical exertion that had him feeling unsteady, it was something deeper, something he was only just beginning to admit to himself. Their friendship had developed almost effortlessly, a gradual blending of two people who understood each other in a way few others did. Midoriya had an openness that Hitoshi admired, a sincerity that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. And yet, as close as they'd grown, he found himself wanting more, not just companionship, but connection, something that went beyond friendship. But that thought was a risk, a step into unknown territory. Hitoshi had always been cautious about trusting others, about letting himself rely on anyone beyond his father and a few trusted mentors. Yet here he was, walking beside Midoriya, feeling a kind of warmth that he hadn't known he needed. Midoriya glanced at him, a smile breaking out on his face. "You did great today, Hitoshi. You've really improved your counters." Hitoshi shrugged, trying to keep his voice neutral, despite the flicker of pride he felt. "Well, I had a good partner." He hesitated before adding, "And, thanks. For everything, I mean. You make training better." Midoriya's smile softened, his eyes holding that unwavering kindness that had always managed to disarm Hitoshi. "That means a lot to me. I think I'm learning just as much from you, if not more. There's this calmness about you that I really respect." Hitoshi looked away, feeling a blush rise to his cheeks. Compliments were hard for him to accept, even from someone like Midoriya, who he knew meant every word. But he forced himself to meet Midoriya's gaze, a rare openness in his expression. "You're one of the only people I feel like I can be myself around," he said quietly. "I don't have to pretend with you." Midoriya's face lit up, a genuine happiness shining through that made Hitoshi's chest feel uncomfortably tight. "That's exactly how I feel too, Hitoshi. I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but I think we bring out the best in each other." They fell into a comfortable silence as they continued down the hall, and Hitoshi found himself reflecting on Midoriya's words. Bringing out the best in each other. It was something he'd heard about from others, but he'd never really believed it until now. Being with Midoriya made him want to be better, to live up to the trust and respect that Midoriya seemed to give so freely. As they reached the end of the hallway, Midoriya hesitated, glancing back at Hitoshi with a look that was both hopeful and uncertain. "Hey, would you want to grab a bite to eat? Maybe off campus? I know a ramen place that's supposed to be really good." Hitoshi felt his heart skip a beat. It was such a simple question, but the casual way Midoriya had asked it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, made it feel like an invitation into something more, a glimpse of what it might be like to have this kind of connection, this closeness, outside of the structured walls of UA. "Yeah, sure," he replied, keeping his tone steady even though his pulse was racing. "Sounds good." Midoriya's face brightened, and they made their way to the school gates, talking about their favorite types of ramen and laughing over the minor injuries they'd acquired during training. Hitoshi felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness, his mind racing as he considered the implications of this moment. He'd had friends before, but nothing had ever felt quite like this quiet anticipation, this sense of possibility that seemed to linger in every word and glance. When they reached the ramen shop, they settled into a booth near the back, each taking in the warmth and coziness of the small space. It was a popular place, filled with students and locals alike, but the noise seemed to fade into the background as they focused on each other. They talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing easily between them. Midoriya shared stories of his training, his goals, his hopes for the future, and Hitoshi found himself opening up more than he ever had before, speaking of his own ambitions and the obstacles he'd faced along the way. Somewhere between bites of ramen and shared laughter, Hitoshi felt a shift, a quiet realization settling over him. He was falling for Midoriya, falling for the way he listened without judgment, the way he always seemed to find something to admire, even in Hitoshi's flaws. It was a feeling he'd been too cautious to acknowledge before, but now, sitting across from him in the warm glow of the ramen shop, it was undeniable. "Hitoshi?" Midoriya's voice broke through his thoughts, and Hitoshi realized he'd been quiet for too long, his gaze fixed somewhere over Midoriya's shoulder. "Sorry," he murmured, shaking his head. "I was just thinking." Midoriya smiled, his eyes soft. "About anything in particular?" Hitoshi hesitated, the words on the tip of his tongue, but he forced himself to take a steadying breath. Just about how things have changed since we met. I didn't expect to find someone I could rely on like this. Midoriya's expression softened, a gentle understanding in his gaze. Me neither. I guess sometimes the best friendships happen when you least expect them. Hitoshi nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. Friendship. It was safer to leave it at that, to let things stay as they were. But a part of him, a part he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before, wanted more. He wanted to see if this connection could grow into something deeper, something lasting. They finished their meal, each lost in their own thoughts as they made their way back to campus. The walk was filled with comfortable silence, punctuated by the occasional shared glance and soft laughter. And as they reached the dorms, Hitoshi found himself feeling a strange mix of contentment and longing, an urge to say something more, to let Midoriya know just how much this bond meant to him. But instead, he paused at the entrance, his voice quiet. Thanks, Midoriya. For everything. I don't think I say it enough, but I really appreciate you. Midoriya's face softened, and he reached out, giving Hitoshi's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. You don't have to thank me, Hitoshi. I'm just glad we met. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging in the air between them. And though Hitoshi wasn't sure what the future held, he knew that he'd hold on to this moment, this connection, and let it guide him wherever it might lead. For now, it was enough. Midoriya lay awake in his dorm room that night, his mind racing as he replayed the evening over and over in his head. The ramen shop, the laughter, the quiet moments that had lingered between them, it all felt like something out of a dream, something he hadn't quite believed could happen until it did. He'd always thought he understood what friendship was, but this connection with Hitoshi, it was different. It was more, somehow. There was something unspoken between them, a feeling that had grown quietly, gradually, with every sparring session, every conversation. Hitoshi wasn't like anyone he'd ever known, strong, steady, but also guarded in a way that made Midoriya want to reach out, to break down those walls and understand the person underneath. And the more time he spent with him, the more he found himself caring, wanting to be there, to know him in ways that went beyond friendship. He turned over, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Hitoshi felt the same. He'd seen the way Hitoshi looked at him sometimes, those moments when he'd let his guard down just enough for Midoriya to catch a glimpse of something deeper. But there was always a hesitation there, a carefulness that held Hitoshi back, as if he were afraid of getting too close, of being vulnerable. Does he even feel the same way? Midoriya wondered, his chest tightening at the thought. Part of him wanted to ask, to finally speak the words he'd kept locked away, but a larger part of him was terrified of what might happen if he did. Hitoshi was his friend, his partner, and the last thing he wanted was to jeopardize that. But at the same time, the feelings were becoming harder to ignore, harder to push aside. He sighed, reaching for his phone. His thumb hovered over Hitoshi's contact, the temptation to send a message, to say something, almost overwhelming. He could imagine it so easily, a simple thank you for tonight, an acknowledgement of how much he appreciated Hitoshi's presence in his life. But as he stared at the screen, his courage faltered, and he put the phone down, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. What if he doesn't feel the same? The thought lingered, heavy and uncertain. But he forced himself to remember the way Hitoshi had looked at him earlier, the way he'd smiled, that rare, genuine expression that seemed reserved only for Midoriya. It was enough to give him hope, even if only a fragile one. The next morning, Midoriya found himself distracted in class, his thoughts drifting back to Hitoshi again and again. It was hard to focus on anything else, hard to push aside the memory of Hitoshi's quiet laugh, the way his eyes had softened when they'd talked. By the time lunch rolled around, he was practically counting down the minutes until he could see him again, the anticipation settling like a warm weight in his chest. He made his way to the cafeteria, scanning the crowd for Hitoshi. When he finally spotted him sitting alone at one of the tables, his heart skipped a beat, and he felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. Taking a steadying breath, he walked over, his pulse racing as he slid into the seat across from him. "Hey, Hitoshi," he greeted, trying to keep his voice casual, despite the flutter of nerves in his chest. Hitoshi looked up, his usual reserved expression softening slightly. "Midoriya. Thought you'd be sitting with the others today." Midoriya shrugged, giving a small smile. "Well, I figured I'd keep you company. Besides, I wanted to thank you for yesterday. I had a really great time." Hitoshi's eyes flickered with a hint of surprise before he nodded, a small smile curving at his lips. "Same here. It was nice. Haven't done something like that in a while." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Midoriya could feel the words building up inside him, the things he wanted to say but couldn't quite bring himself to voice. He wanted to tell Hitoshi how much he valued him, how much he appreciated every moment they spent together. But the fear of saying too much, of risking the friendship they'd built, held him back. Instead, he settled for a question, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think things are going to change?" Hitoshi looked at him, his eyes thoughtful. "Change how?" Midoriya hesitated, searching for the right words. "I mean, we've been spending a lot of time together, training and all that. And I guess I don't want things to feel different or awkward, you know? I like how things are." There was a brief pause, and Midoriya braced himself, his heart pounding as he waited for Hitoshi's response. He could feel the weight of the unspoken emotions between them, the delicate balance they were both trying to maintain. Hitoshi's gaze softened, his expression almost contemplative. "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "And, yeah, I like how things are, too." The words filled Midoriya with a quiet relief, but also a renewed sense of longing. He could feel the depth of his emotions, the quiet yearning that he couldn't ignore. And yet, he knew that he wasn't quite ready to take that leap, not yet. For now, he would let things remain as they were, hoping that someday, he'd find the courage to say what he truly felt. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing the occasional smile or glance that spoke of the closeness they'd built. And though the words remained unspoken, Midoriya knew, deep down, that he was grateful for this connection, this bond that felt more real and significant than anything he'd ever known. As they finished their meal and headed off to their next class, Midoriya felt a quiet hope settle in his heart, a hope that, whatever the future held, they would face it together. And maybe, someday, he'd find the right moment to tell Hitoshi how much he meant to him. For now, though, he would hold on to this, savoring each shared moment, each quiet glance, each laugh that made his heart beat a little faster. Because, in the end, it was enough. At least for now. Chapter 6, Confession and Consolation. Aizawa leaned back in his chair in the staff room, sipping his coffee as he reviewed the latest progress reports on his students. His sharp eyes skimmed over the usual notes and evaluations, but his thoughts kept drifting to Hitoshi. Over the past few weeks, he'd watched Hitoshi grow, not just in terms of skill, but in confidence, and that confidence was tied unmistakably to his bond with Midoriya. It wasn't just friendship, Aizawa realized, though he had tried to keep himself from looking too deeply into it. He'd seen the quiet glances, the soft smiles that seemed reserved for Midoriya alone, and the way Hitoshi carried himself with a subtle ease whenever they were together. It was new, and it made Aizawa both proud and, he had to admit, a little apprehensive. You're in your head again." Hizashi's voice broke through his thoughts, snapping him back to the present. He glanced up to see his friend grinning, sliding into the chair beside him. "Let me guess. Hitoshi?" Aizawa sighed, setting down his coffee. "I can't help it. He's getting closer to Midoriya. They're practically inseparable now." Hizashi chuckled, his expression softening. "And that bothers you?" "Not exactly," Aizawa murmured, pausing as he searched for the right words. "I just worry. Hitoshi has always been careful with people, and now, He's letting his guard down in ways I haven't seen before. It's good for him, I know that. But if things don't work out, he trailed off, feeling the weight of his own concern settle over him. Hisashi nodded thoughtfully, tapping his fingers on the table. I get it. You want to protect him, make sure he doesn't get hurt. But you've taught him well, show. He's resilient, and he's got you in his corner. And besides, Hisashi added with a grin, Midoriya is a good kid. If anyone's going to understand Hitoshi, it's him. Aizawa gave a slow nod, his gaze distant. I know. I see how they are together, and there's something genuine there. But it's also a risk. Isn't that part of life, though? Hisashi said softly, his tone unusually serious. Letting people in, opening yourself up to the possibility of getting hurt? I think Hitoshi's figured that out. He trusts Midoriya, and maybe it's time we do too. Aizawa sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he considered Hisashi's words. His friend was right, Hitoshi was strong, more so than he often gave him credit for. And Midoriya, well, he was one of the most compassionate students Aizawa had ever met. If there was anyone he could trust with Hitoshi's heart, it was probably him. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Midnight, who slid into a seat nearby with a mischievous grin. Are we talking about Shinsou and Midoriya? She asked, a twinkle in her eye. Aizawa shot her a look, but she only laughed. What? It's cute. They're clearly good for each other. He tried to ignore the teasing glint in her eyes, but there was no denying that she, like everyone else, had noticed the connection between Hitoshi and Midoriya. It seemed that even the staff had picked up on the bond forming between the two, though most had the good sense to keep their observations to themselves. After a moment, Midnight's smile softened. You've done well with Hitoshi, Shoyuta. He's stronger than you realize, and he's growing into his own. Maybe it's time to let him take this next step. Aizawa looked away, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. You're probably right. It's just hard, sometimes. I want to make sure he's safe. And he is, Hisashi chimed in. He's got a solid head on his shoulders, and he's got you. Letting him navigate this is part of him growing up. They sat in silence for a moment, and Aizawa felt a quiet sense of reassurance settle over him. He wasn't used to talking about his feelings, especially when it came to Hitoshi, but his friends had a way of reminding him that he wasn't alone in this. He didn't have to protect Hitoshi from everything, sometimes, he just had to be there to pick him up if he fell. Later that day, Aizawa found himself watching another training session, though this one was different. The focus wasn't on sparring or strategy, but on communication, teamwork, and trust. The class was split into pairs, with each pair assigned a unique scenario to navigate. Hitoshi and Midoriya were, unsurprisingly, partnered up, and as he watched them work through their exercise, Aizawa felt a sense of calm settle over him. They moved together with an understanding that went beyond words, each anticipating the other's movements with a natural ease. It was as if they were in their own world, oblivious to everyone else, and Aizawa realized that this wasn't just friendship. This was something deeper, something that felt almost inevitable. As the session wrapped up, Hitoshi glanced over, catching Aizawa's eye with a quiet nod. There was a silent understanding between them, a promise that no matter what happened, they would both be okay. And in that moment, Aizawa knew that he had to trust Hitoshi to follow his own path, to make his own choices, even if it meant risking heartbreak. Later that evening, Aizawa found himself thinking about their conversation, about the subtle yet undeniable shift in Hitoshi's demeanor whenever he was with Midoriya. He could see the happiness, the ease, that Hitoshi carried now, and he felt a quiet pride in knowing that his son was finding his way, even if it meant letting go just a little. He'd always been protective of Hitoshi, always tried to shield him from the harsher realities of life. But now, watching him grow, he understood that his role wasn't to prevent Hitoshi from getting hurt, it was to give him the tools to face whatever came his way. And right now, he was watching Hitoshi take that first step, reaching out to someone who might just become one of the most important people in his life. For the first time, Aizawa felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that, whatever happened, Hitoshi would be okay. And as he closed his eyes that night, he found himself smiling, a rare but genuine expression of hope and pride in his son's journey. Hitoshi sat alone in one of Yui's quiet study rooms, a dim light illuminating the page of his open notebook. He had meant to get some studying done, but his mind had wandered off hours ago. The words and formulas on the page were nothing more than a blur, his thoughts completely absorbed by the recent changes in his life, specifically, his growing feelings for Midoriya. He hadn't planned on letting anyone get this close. Over the years, he'd become skilled at keeping people at a distance, at managing his emotions so they wouldn't betray him. But with Midoriya, all of that seemed to unravel. Midoriya made him feel safe, seen, in a way that no one else ever had. And that safety brought a kind of vulnerability that he wasn't sure he was ready for. Yet here he was, his chest tight with a longing he couldn't shake, a feeling he could no longer deny. He'd spent countless nights replaying their conversations, their shared laughs, the quiet moments that felt like they belonged to just the two of them. And as much as he tried to tell himself that it was just a close friendship, he knew it was something more, something he wanted to hold on to, even if it scared him. He closed his notebook, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. Maybe it was time to tell Midoriya. The thought sent a thrill of excitement through him, mingling with an overwhelming sense of fear. What if Midoriya didn't feel the same? What if this admission changed everything between them? But he thought of Midoriya's smile, his unshakable kindness, the way he had always treated Hitoshi as just Hitoshi, not as someone to be feared or misunderstood. Midoriya had accepted him from the beginning, never questioning his past or his struggles. Maybe, just maybe, he would understand this too. As he considered his next move, there was a soft knock on the door, and Hitoshi turned to see none other than Midoriya himself standing in the doorway, his expression warm but curious. "Hey," Midoriya greeted, stepping inside. "I saw the light on. Thought I'd check if you were okay." Hitoshi's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly masked his surprise with a faint smile. "Yeah, just thinking, I guess." Midoriya closed the door behind him, taking a seat across from Hitoshi. "Thinking about anything in particular?" Hitoshi hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of his notebook. He felt his pulse quicken, the words he wanted to say caught somewhere between his heart and his throat. But as he looked into Midoriya's gentle, open gaze, the words came easier than he'd expected. "Actually, yeah," he began, his voice quiet. "I've been thinking a lot about us. About everything that's happened since we met." Midoriya's eyes widened slightly, a hint of curiosity and something else, something softer, reflecting in his gaze. "Oh?" Hitoshi took a steadying breath, his heart pounding as he spoke. "You're different, Midoriya. I mean, I know you're different. Everyone knows that. But to me, it's more than that. You've made me feel like I don't have to pretend. Like I don't have to keep my guard up all the time." Midoriya's expression softened, and he reached out, placing a gentle hand on Hitoshi's. The simple gesture sent a warmth through Hitoshi's chest, and he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, Midoriya understood. "Hitoshi," Midoriya murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want you to feel like you have to pretend around me. You're amazing, just as you are. And I'm really glad we met, too." The words filled Hitoshi with a quiet courage, and he decided, in that moment, to take the leap. He looked down at their joined hands, gathering his thoughts before meeting Midoriya's gaze again. "I've been wanting to tell you something," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I know we're friends, and I'm grateful for that. But it's more than that for me. I think I'm starting to feel something more." Midoriya's eyes widened, a look of surprise, and something that looked almost like relief, crossing his face. He let out a breath, his fingers tightening around Hitoshi's. Hitoshi, I think I've felt the same way for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it. The relief that washed over Hitoshi was almost overwhelming, and he felt his shoulders relax, the tension that had been building for days finally fading. He managed a small smile, a genuine one, as he took in Midoriya's words, letting them sink in. I was worried, Hitoshi admitted, his voice soft. I didn't want to ruin what we had, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. Midoriya's expression softened, and he reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from Hitoshi's face. I'm glad you told me. I don't want to hide how I feel either. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared confession settling over them like a quiet promise. For the first time in his life, Hitoshi felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Finally, Midoriya spoke, his voice gentle. I don't know what this means, or where it'll lead, but I'd like to find out. Together. Hitoshi's smile grew, and he nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Yeah. I'd like that too. They stayed like that, hands intertwined, the quiet intimacy between them a silent promise of what was to come. And as they sat there, Hitoshi felt a sense of hope and possibility he hadn't dared to believe in. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there would be challenges and moments of doubt. But for now, this was enough. As they left the study room together, walking side by side down the empty corridor, Hitoshi couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for Midoriya's presence in his life, for his unwavering kindness, for the connection they'd built. He'd spent years believing that he had to keep everyone at arm's length, that he was better off alone. But now, with Midoriya by his side, he knew that he was stronger than he'd ever been, and that, no matter what came next, he wouldn't have to face it alone. For the first time, Hitoshi felt like he was ready to take that step forward, to let someone in completely, and to see where this path would lead. And as he glanced over at Midoriya, seeing the same quiet hope mirrored in his friend's gaze, he knew that whatever the future held, they'd face it together. Hitoshi sat alone in one of Yui's quiet study rooms, a dim light illuminating the page of his open notebook. He had meant to get some studying done, but his mind had wandered off hours ago. The words and formulas on the page were nothing more than a blur, his thoughts completely absorbed by the recent changes in his life, specifically, his growing feelings for Midoriya. He hadn't planned on letting anyone get this close. Over the years, he'd become skilled at keeping people at a distance, at managing his emotions so they wouldn't betray him. But with Midoriya, all of that seemed to unravel. Midoriya made him feel safe, seen, in a way that no one else ever had. And that safety brought a kind of vulnerability that he wasn't sure he was ready for. Yet here he was, his chest tight with a longing he couldn't shake, a feeling he could no longer deny. He'd spent countless nights replaying their conversations, their shared laughs, the quiet moments that felt like they belonged to just the two of them. And as much as he tried to tell himself that it was just a close friendship, he knew it was something more, something he wanted to hold on to, even if it scared him. He closed his notebook, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. Maybe it was time to tell Midoriya. The thought sent a thrill of excitement through him, mingling with an overwhelming sense of fear. What if Midoriya didn't feel the same? What if this admission changed everything between them? But he thought of Midoriya's smile, his unshakable kindness, the way he had always treated Hitoshi as just Hitoshi, not as someone to be feared or misunderstood. Midoriya had accepted him from the beginning, never questioning his past or his struggles. Maybe, just maybe, he would understand this too. As he considered his next move, there was a soft knock on the door, and Hitoshi turned to see none other than Midoriya himself standing in the doorway, his expression warm but curious. Hey, Midoriya greeted, stepping inside. I saw the light on. Thought I'd check if you were okay. Hitoshi's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly masked his surprise with a faint smile. Yeah, just thinking, I guess. Midoriya closed the door behind him, taking a seat across from Hitoshi. Thinking about anything in particular? Hitoshi hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of his notebook. He felt his pulse quicken, the words he wanted to say caught somewhere between his heart and his throat. But as he looked into Midoriya's gentle, open gaze, the words came easier than he'd expected. Actually, yeah, he began, his voice quiet. I've been thinking a lot about us. About everything that's happened since we met. Midoriya's eyes widened slightly, a hint of curiosity and something else, something softer, reflecting in his gaze. Oh? Hitoshi took a steadying breath, his heart pounding as he spoke. You're different, Midoriya. I mean, I know you're different. Everyone knows that. But to me, it's more than that. You've made me feel like I don't have to pretend. Like I don't have to keep my guard up all the time. Midoriya's expression softened, and he reached out, placing a gentle hand on Hitoshi's. The simple gesture sent a warmth through Hitoshi's chest, and he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, Midoriya understood. Hitoshi, Midoriya murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want you to feel like you have to pretend around me. You're amazing, just as you are. And I'm really glad we met, too. The words filled Hitoshi with a quiet courage, and he decided, in that moment, to take the leap. He looked down at their joined hands, gathering his thoughts before meeting Midoriya's gaze again. I've been wanting to tell you something, he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. I know we're friends, and I'm grateful for that. But it's more than that for me. I think I'm starting to feel something more. Midoriya's eyes widened, a look of surprise, and something that looked almost like relief, crossing his face. He let out a breath, his fingers tightening around Hitoshi's. Hitoshi, I think I've felt the same way for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it. The relief that washed over Hitoshi was almost overwhelming, and he felt his shoulders relax, the tension that had been building for days finally fading. He managed a small smile, a genuine one, as he took in Midoriya's words, letting them sink in. I was worried, Hitoshi admitted, his voice soft. I didn't want to ruin what we had, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. Midoriya's expression softened, and he reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from Hitoshi's face. I'm glad you told me. I don't want to hide how I feel either. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared confession settling over them like a quiet promise. For the first time in his life, Hitoshi felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Finally, Midoriya spoke, his voice gentle. I don't know what this means, or where it'll lead, but I'd like to find out. Together. Hitoshi's smile grew, and he nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Yeah. I'd like that too. They stayed like that, hands intertwined, the quiet intimacy between them a silent promise of what was to come. And as they sat there, Hitoshi felt a sense of hope and possibility he hadn't dared to believe in. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there would be challenges and moments of doubt. But for now, this was enough. As they left the study room together, walking side by side down the empty corridor, Hitoshi couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for Midoriya's presence in his life, for his unwavering kindness, for the connection they'd built. He'd spent years believing that he had to keep everyone at arm's length, that he was better off alone. But now, with Midoriya by his side, he knew that he was stronger than he'd ever been, and that, no matter what came next, he wouldn't have to face it alone. For the first time, Hitoshi felt like he was ready to take that step forward, to let someone in completely, and to see where this path would lead. And as he glanced over at Midoriya, seeing the same quiet hope mirrored in his friend's gaze, he knew that whatever the future held, they'd face it together. Chapter 7, New Beginnings. Aizawa watched the class wrap up their last training session before the weekend, his sharp gaze tracking Hitoshi and Midoriya as they moved side by side across the training grounds. There was a natural ease in the way they interacted now, an unspoken rhythm that only deepened each time they worked together. It was more than teamwork, it was trust, a bond that had grown through shared challenges, quiet conversations, and, Aizawa suspected, a lot of unspoken words. In truth, he'd been expecting this development for a while now. As much as Hitoshi tried to keep his emotions contained, Aizawa knew his son well enough to notice the subtle shifts in his behavior, the slight softening in his demeanor whenever Midoriya was around. It was a gentleness he hadn't often seen in Hitoshi, a willingness to be vulnerable that had once seemed out of reach. And for the first time, Aizawa felt a sense of peace about it all. He'd been worried initially, unsure if Hitoshi was ready to let someone in so fully. But seeing them together now, watching the way Midoriya's steady presence balanced Hitoshi's reserved nature, Aizawa knew he'd made the right decision to step back and let Hitoshi navigate this on his own terms. Hisashi joined him at the edge of the training grounds, his usual grin softening as he followed Aizawa's line of sight. "They've come a long way, haven't they?" Aizawa nodded, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "They have. Hitoshi's happy. And I think he's finally realizing that it's okay to let someone be there for him." "Midoriya's been good for him," Hisashi added, crossing his arms as he watched the two boys exchange a laugh. "And Hitoshi's been good for Midoriya, too. They're like two puzzle pieces that fit just right." Aizawa chuckled softly, appreciating the truth in Hisashi's words. It was more than just compatibility, there was a quiet strength in their connection, a mutual respect that went beyond friendship. They challenged each other, supported each other, and, perhaps most importantly, they understood each other in a way that only two people who had overcome countless obstacles could. As the students filed out of the training grounds, Hitoshi caught sight of Aizawa and Hisashi watching from the sidelines. He gave a brief nod, his expression calm yet carrying a warmth that spoke volumes. Midoriya followed suit, giving a small wave before turning back to finish packing up. Hisashi nudged Aizawa playfully. "You know, you've done an amazing job with him. He's growing up, finding his way, and he's still the kind of person who values loyalty, respect, and kindness. That's all thanks to you." Aizawa shook his head, though he couldn't hide the pride in his eyes. "No, that's all him. Hitoshi's the one who made the choice to open up, to let people in. I just gave him the space to make that choice." Hisashi grinned, clapping him on the back. "Modest as always. But really, you deserve some credit, too. You've been there for him every step of the way, and that's what made the difference." Aizawa said nothing, letting the quiet acknowledgement settle over him. He knew he'd done his best to guide Hitoshi, to help him become the person he was meant to be. And now, watching Hitoshi's bond with Midoriya deepen, he realized that perhaps he'd done something right after all. As Hitoshi and Midoriya approached, Aizawa straightened, his usual stern expression softening as he addressed them. "Good work today, both of you. Keep this up, and you'll be more than prepared for whatever comes your way." Hitoshi met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks, Dad. It means a lot to hear that." The words took Aizawa by surprise, the rare acknowledgement warming him in a way he hadn't expected. He gave a slight nod, his voice steady. "You've earned it." They exchanged a brief but meaningful look before Hitoshi turned to Midoriya, a small smile playing at his lips. And in that moment, Aizawa knew that his son had finally found the support he'd been searching for all along. Hitoshi walked alongside Midoriya, down the familiar path from the training grounds, a quiet sense of contentment settling over him. The day had been exhausting, but the kind that left him feeling accomplished and grounded. It wasn't just the physical work that satisfied him, though, it was the knowledge that he'd had someone by his side, someone who understood him on a level that went beyond words. They reached a quiet spot near the edge of campus, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. It was a beautiful sight, but Hitoshi's gaze drifted to Midoriya, the sunset's warm light reflecting off his friend's, his partner's, face. He felt his chest tighten, a blend of emotions too vast to name, and he allowed himself to savor the moment, feeling a warmth he'd rarely known before. Today was, a lot, Midoriya said with a laugh, rubbing the back of his neck as he looked over at Hitoshi. But I think we did well. We make a good team. Hitoshi nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. We do. I don't think I would have gotten this far without you. Midoriya's face softened, a gentle understanding in his eyes. You give yourself too little credit, Hitoshi. You've come this far because of who you are. I'm just glad I got to be here for it. Hitoshi felt his pulse quicken, the vulnerability in Midoriya's words catching him off guard. This openness, this acceptance, it was something he was still getting used to, but with Midoriya, it felt like second nature. He could feel his walls crumbling, the defenses he'd held on to for so long becoming less necessary with each passing day. You make it easy, Hitoshi murmured, his voice low. Being myself, I mean. It's something I never thought I'd have. I've spent so much time keeping people out, and now. He trailed off, uncertain of how to express the depth of his gratitude, of his feelings. But Midoriya seemed to understand, his hand reaching out, resting on Hitoshi's shoulder with a gentle reassurance that spoke volumes. You're not alone anymore, Midoriya said softly, his gaze steady. Whatever comes next, whatever we face, we'll face it together. The words filled Hitoshi with a sense of calm, a peace he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. He thought back to the years he'd spent in solitude, the times he'd believed that no one would ever understand him, that his quirk and his past would always set him apart. But now, with Midoriya by his side, he felt that he'd finally found a place where he belonged. A soft breeze stirred the air around them, and Hitoshi felt a quiet resolve settling in his heart. He wanted this bond, this connection, to be something lasting, something he could carry forward with him. And for the first time, he felt ready to open himself up fully, to let Midoriya see the parts of him that he'd hidden away for so long. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For everything. Midoriya's smile was warm, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that left Hitoshi feeling both vulnerable and safe. You don't have to thank me, Hitoshi. I'm just glad you let me in. They stood there in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, yet bound by a shared sense of trust and purpose. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hitoshi felt the quiet certainty of his future taking shape before him. He didn't know where this path would lead or what challenges they'd face, but he knew that, with Midoriya by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. With one last look at each other, they turned back toward the dorms, walking side by side, their steps in sync, their bond unbreakable. And as they walked, Hitoshi couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of a journey that would shape them both in ways they hadn't yet imagined. Because, together, they were unstoppable. As Midoriya walked back toward the dorms with Hitoshi, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the peace that came with reaching the end of a long day or the satisfaction of overcoming a difficult training session, it was deeper, quieter, a calm that came from finally understanding that he had someone beside him who saw him, understood him, and accepted him as he was. He glanced over at Hitoshi, who walked beside him with that steady, confident stride, his face softened by the remnants of the sunset. Midoriya couldn't help but feel a quiet awe at how much had changed in such a short time. Just months ago, he wouldn't have imagined this, the quiet, reserved Hitoshi opening up to him, sharing his thoughts, his fears, and his hopes. And now, they were here, side by side, bound by a friendship that felt like so much more. They reached the dorm building, and Midoriya stopped, turning to face Hitoshi fully. He could feel the weight of everything he wanted to say pressing against his heart, but he struggled to find the words. There were too many emotions, too many thoughts, and he wasn't sure if he could express it all. Thank you, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. For trusting me, for letting me in. I don't think I ever really felt like I belonged anywhere before. But with you, it feels different. Like I'm not alone. Hitoshi's gaze softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You're not alone, Midoriya. You never have to be, not with me. The words hit Midoriya with a gentle force, filling him with a warmth he could only describe as home. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear those words until now, hadn't understood the weight he'd been carrying, the weight of always trying to prove himself, to make others see him as something more than just another student trying to be a hero. With Hitoshi, all of that pressure faded. There was no need to prove himself, no need to be anything other than who he was. And that acceptance, that quiet, unwavering support, was something he knew he'd hold on to for the rest of his life. I'm glad it's you, Hitoshi, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't imagine this journey without you. Hitoshi's expression grew thoughtful, a hint of vulnerability flickering in his eyes. He took a step closer, and for a moment they stood in silence, the distance between them almost non-existent. Midoriya felt his heart race, a mixture of anticipation and quiet joy filling him as he met Hitoshi's steady gaze. Then, without another word, Hitoshi reached out, pulling Midoriya into a gentle embrace. It was soft, tentative at first, but as Midoriya wrapped his arms around Hitoshi in return, the embrace grew stronger, more certain. They stayed like that for a moment, the world around them fading into the background, leaving just the two of them standing there, connected by something deeper than words. When they finally pulled back, Midoriya felt a smile spread across his face, his heart light, his worries and fears melting away. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles they would face, he knew they would face them together. And that was enough. As they said their goodnights and parted ways, Midoriya felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over him. He returned to his dorm room, his thoughts racing with dreams of the future, of training, of becoming a hero, and of walking that path with Hitoshi by his side. Lying in bed that night, he felt a quiet confidence that he knew would guide him through whatever came next. This was just the beginning, the first step in a journey that he was now certain he wouldn't have to face alone. And as he closed his eyes, he let the warmth of that knowledge fill him, knowing that whatever happened, he had found something worth holding on to. Because together, they were stronger than they had ever been alone. And that, he realized, was the true start of everything he had dreamed of. This is the end of Shadows and Sparks by the Angel Demon on AO3. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any suggestion, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to know when the next one is out. Have a good day, angels.